It looks as though I hit upon an attractive subject. We've had several snickers from various locations regarding it, but I think it is a very basic problem, and that is an effort to understand the compound nature of ignorance. Now, in order to understand it, I think we have to go back and see what is happening or has happened in the early ages of the earth. After the Lord said to all creatures, "Be fruitful and multiply," the next requirement was some kind of survival. Survival became the primary need of living things. Survival was hazarded by danger, and the dangers of that time were natural dangers, disasters. The primitive world fighting for survival. So in the beginning, all effort on the part of living things was to develop the pressure or impulse to survive. This was apparently created with them, for that which is fashioned is expected to endure at least for a time. So survival was the primary problem of the human being and of all natural creatures around him on the earth. Survival required something. Complete ignorance was not capable of survival. And yet there was no clear demarcation between ignorance and anything else. And so far as we can understand in those days, ignorance ruled the world, because there was really no situation permitting the individual to develop an orderly sequence of rules or obligations of government. The survival principle, however, was very strong and has always been strong and is still to this time. So survival began to involve something else. It involved some kind of source of information. The creature was not born with a fully developed mentality capable of reading, writing, and arithmetic. The creature was born in a kind of a state of bewilderment, but as bad as things were, he hoped to stay here for a while. Therefore, the problem of trying to find out what hurt the least, what accomplished the most, and how to expend life most usefully in some way, all these were primary objectives. And in these objectives, the only possible source of information and instructions were experience arising from observation and personal contact. Experience must do some good. And primitive man, in desperate need of everything, began to be interested in experience. He began to observe that certain things he did got him into further trouble. Other experiences indicated that on right occasion he did something right, and this sort of eased things a little bit. And so the problem of experience also included watching the experiences of others. He watched the various prehistoric animals, he watched the various semi-domesticated ones, and he watched also the actions of others of his own kind. And he began to realize that these others of his own kind shared his dilemma, but also to observe common observation, rules of survival could gradually be created. So survival was the result of watching other things live and die, watching the various processes and procedures by which the common obvious dangers of life could be averted or reduced. This, therefore, was the beginning of education. Education was the gradual accumulating of knowledge of things practical and useful. In old days there were no colleges, universities, or anything of this kind, but there were the elders. And those who had experienced the most were recognized as the guardians of those who had experienced less. And all the lives coming into this world were given certain help and information by the elders, the old ones, the truths, those who had experienced, those who knew, those who had watched, observed, and contemplated. Now, all of this would be very rudimentary in terms of our present thinking, but it was possible for the old to more or less clarify some of the doubts of that time, to make things a little easier for those who were still in swamp and jungle. The olds could tell a little bit more about the nature of survival. They were the ones who had walked in strange places. They knew what was beyond the hills. They knew what was on the other side of the river. And this constituted higher education. And this education gradually went on until it resulted in a moderate state of security. It wasn't a severe and complete security. It wasn't anything that you might say made life as we know it now, but it did extend the probabilities of survival. And it did help the individual to realize that he could know more than he did. Now, of course, ignorance may be just simply based on the concept of ignorance. The individual who's seen things happening around him, observed nothing, and profited nothing, the person who watched others suffer and did the same thing that caused them to suffer, were in this difficulty because they had ignored experience or had failed to observe. So ignorance was the failure to observe, the failure to share in common knowledge, and the failure to recognize the processes of universal law. So survival began gradually to impose upon creatures the fact that there were rules to the game, that no matter how you began or where you went, there were laws governing everything. The mistakes were consistently similar. When things were done well, there were certain securities and improvements achieved. And when you ignored the whole thing, you struggled along below the level of the intelligence of your own kind and came finally to oblivion. So the beginning of it all was the recognition that there were rules, and the old ones repeated this and instructed the young. They set up various forms of passing on information, and it was always the elder teaching the younger, because there were no other sources of instruction. But this instruction included passing on the importance of watching nature, seeing how things operate around us, relating ourselves to the behavior patterns of other creatures, and finally refraining from those things which consistently prove harmful or hurtful. So little by little, a native kind of intelligence came up. We would call it today sheer ignorance, because in our terms of thinking, this primitive believing was little better than idolatry, little better than imagination. But even in those days, there seemed to be a rule governing imagination. If you imagined certain things, it was better. If you imagined certain other things, it was worse. And out of it all came the inevitable realization of better and worse, of good and evil, of security and insecurity, of emotion towards something better or of falling back into something worse. Nature never stood still. Having attained a certain degree of security, enough to build a hut or hollow out a cave on the side of a hill, the next thing that came after the problem of security that was most close to everyone was rebellion. We find the scriptures very clearly pointing this point out. The moment the individual attained a certain security, he wanted liberty. He wanted to do as he pleased. He wanted to be himself. He wanted to view the environment around him as something useful to himself. And as time went on, he began to be ambitious to dominate this environment. And out of this particular type of thinking came an impulse to freedom. This impulse to freedom now extends to practically every department of nature. Every creature that has discovered existence has attained a certain pattern of security, then wishes to achieve liberty, to be free from domination. Obviously, the first and common domination was the environment. The individual wanted to be free from the pressure of the necessity of doing certain things simply because they were there. He wanted to begin to think in terms of being a person. And the moment he began to feel like a person, he got into trouble. Because this is a very dangerous feeling. Still is. The individual, however, having decided he wanted to be free, began to use every faculty at his possession to achieve freedom. Out of it all, the determination to do what he pleased. Freedom wasn't very much in those times at best, but it was a rebellion against inevitables. It was an idea that the person could be stronger than the laws of his environment, and in fact could go so far ultimately as to create new laws of environment, and that these laws which he created were stronger than the laws of nature. This was another fundamental error, but it did rise inevitably in the thinking of human beings. So we got the survival person, and we have the individual who in his survival wishes to change his own destiny, wishes to do something of himself, wishes to possess something himself, wishes to train or dedicate some ability, but most of all, self-expression, to escape from a kind of bondage which was an imprisonment within the framework of natural law. So as long as man has existed, he has resisted in many ways the pressures of nature around him. He has wished to dominate everything, but as yet has never developed the faculties and powers capable of domination. So this brings us to the next step in the problem. Domination, which he wanted very definitely, was for a reason. He wanted to be better than somebody else. He wanted to be stronger than someone else. He wanted to be richer than someone else. So a whole group of patterns were created by which the individual could satisfy his own ambitions. Ambition arose by comparison with other things. There were creatures stronger than he was, creatures that lived longer, that were more fleet of foot. There were all kinds of things around him which he could not really compete with. But he also found the possibility of competing with the mutual abilities of his own kind. So he wanted to establish the Olympic Games or something by which he would create a competition based upon the idea of achieving greatness over something else, to have a stronger will, a stronger purpose. And the will became willful. And because of this willfulness fell the angels, according to Bernays, German mystic. Actually, therefore, we gradually get the person around to the point where he may be still in a wigwam or a cave or a mud hut, but he was now a person groping for progress, hunting and seeking ways of releasing himself from the entanglement of all other kinds of things. Now, in this time also we have rising up, however, a few mysterious people, or mysterious beings, which are sometimes referred to as the ancient priests. There were some that were born, apparently, with a certain difference of attitude, a certain tendency not to create a conflict with natural law, but to try to understand that law was better than man's way of doing things. The gradual discovery which ultimately produced the priest, or the medicine man, or the psychic leader of a tribe, these were recognitions, possibly by extra sensitivity of the individual, that there was something that if you didn't play the game right, you got into trouble. That therefore there should be some way of restoring the dignity of the rules, the laws of nature, the laws of the universe. The universe at that time probably was a small square of land inhabited by a few people and a lot of strange creatures. But in any event, it was life. It was a pattern of things. It was a place. It was our share of the good earth. So the one person who became more attentive to procedures began to realize that the more the individual